which were significant effects. So significant effects at the kind of were biased towards, and that kind of led to more of an inflation bias, people almost pushing more towards that significant result. And kind of that led to other issues. So kind of research requires funding, everyone knows that, and that's usually given by grants, kind of grant givers, charities, and governments and the like. And they want to give money to those who they think are trustworthy. And who's trustworthy? Well, people who have past publications, because we know that they are able to take money and turn it into, research and do it successfully. So those with more publications were more likely to win grants, and that led to something called a publish or perish culture. I like to call it pop culture because it sounds a little bit derogatory, and that is the intent. So kind of the historic issues with pop culture were that it caused journals to have kind of less of a leaning toward publication of replications because they were seen as like less sexy, basically. And that was especially the case in biological and social sciences. And but there was also an incentive to reward quantity over quality. And so people were kind of pushing towards novel results instead of replicating, as I mentioned before, because journals weren't publishing replications. People were kind of having to change their research to go what's popular instead of what's scientifically interesting. And this led to a high false positive rate, because if you're only submitting stuff that has a significant result, then you kind of have a high likelihood of finding false positives that also get published. And this also meant the converse of that null results weren't getting reported, to the point where people weren't even writing up their null results. They knew they wouldn't get published. They were like, there's not even any point. So 65% of all null results were just barely even being attempted to be written up. And that led to something called the file drawer problem, where, I did 3 years of research and it was not significant, so I just stuck it in my file drawer and moved on. And that was kind of a major issue. So is everything you know a lie? And I would say, no, research is an ever-evolving practice. Hypothesis testing only started in the early 20th century, peer review only became common in the mid-20th century. And so there's always more suggestions being made on how we can improve our research practice. And something that I felt might have been true only a few years ago, this statement from Max Planck, which was from the early 1900s, saying a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die. And this has been paraphrased as science advances one funeral at a time. And like I said, 2 years ago, I really felt that this was true. When James and I gave a similar talk about open science to the Health and Life Science Department at Coventry in 2019, it felt like there was nothing going to happen. But now, Thomas Jenkins, who's hosting this talk, the fact that there's this international open access week, things are changing so much faster than we thought things were going to change, and that's a great thing to see. So speaking of open research, what is it? It's basically having new levels of openness in research, kind of self-explanatory. It does what it says on the tin. The idea is to have open access to papers, which is what other people are going to be talking about in later talks after this one. Open access to data, to the analyses, to materials, to software, so that you can conduct your analyses or run studies for free without having to spend huge amounts of money, or to be gate-kept behind kind of paywalls and things like that. And the idea is to increase transparency of not only the research process, but the outcomes of that research. And transparency, is important in science, just like it is in other things. You wouldn't exactly want to go buy a car that you haven't test driven or looked under the hood for, because no one wants to buy a dud. And so open science is basically trying to stop you from buying a dud in terms of science. So there are 7 major suggestions in terms of kind of data replication and openness and open science practice that have been called for. I'm not going to be focusing on the open access stuff. Like I mentioned, that's for the other talks today. But there's other things that I will be getting onto, is these other 6 things. So making materials open, making data analyses available and replicatable, reducing research degrees of freedom, improve the peer review process, improve credit allocation, and having a more responsible use of metrics. The last 2 of those definitely are my personal hobby horses, but all of these are fairly important. So to look on the 2 kind of biggest ones that have got the most push are looking at researcher degrees of freedom. So earlier I mentioned that removal of the outlier and going, well, if we remove the outlier, things would be significant. That is a researcher degree of freedom. You are free to choose whether you include or exclude that outlier if you haven't said what you're going to do with outliers ahead of time. So a way to minimize research degrees of freedom, i.e. where bias can come in, pre-registration or registered reports are two ways in which you can deal with that. So what a pre-registration is that you will develop your idea, design the study, and then you will put up online somewhere this idea and the design that you have, so kind of an introduction and method section that you'll put up online and say, this is what I'm going to do and this is how I'm going to do it. And then you can go away, collect the data and write it up, referencing that pre-registration, so that when you go to publish it, people can see, well, this is what you said you were going to do, and that's what you did. So that lowers that harking phenomenon that I mentioned beforehand as well. And almost a logical extension of this is the registered report, where instead of publishing just the stuff randomly online to a repository, you actually send your introduction and method section into a journal so that they can give you a review, because they can say, oh, this hypothesis, that's fascinating. However, this methodology is slightly flawed. And so we suggest you make these changes here and tweak this little bit here. And that's really important because that saves you a lot of time, effort, and money. Because if you go away and do the wrong methodology to assess your hypothesis, then that's a lot of wasted time that you've now saved because it's been caught in that peer review early stage process. But then you can go on and collect the data and then write it up. And as long as you've done what you said you were going to do, that stage 2 peer review can happen very, very quickly in a matter of days. And then they'll publish it. If you have made changes for various reasons, money issues, or the methodology didn't quite work as you planned, as long as you write up why that thing changed, again, the stage 2 peer review usually is pretty quick. But one of the major opportunities for that is that because they accepted it at stage 1, even if you've got non-significant results, they're more likely to publish it. And I think that's a fantastic thing because, again, it reduces that file draw problem I was speaking about, and it reduces the kind of other issues that come with science, the high false positive rate. And not only that, but people consider this to be giving a much higher quality of research in terms of methods, in terms of analysis, and just overall quality. Across the board, it seems to be the case that there's a huge increase in quality when people do a registered report versus not registered reports in terms of publication. As well as that, I mentioned that the second one is peer review process. So I mentioned the peer review process that kind of came into fashion in the mid 20th century. And it kind of hasn't changed a lot since then. You submit your article to a journal, that journal editor then goes and picks 2 or 3 peer reviewers even, and then they, usually anonymously go around and go, okay, well, we're gonna, say, is this good, is this bad? They'll send back their thing to the editor, and the editor says, okay, we're going to accept or not accept this paper. And that's kind of, it was a way that we did things. It was kind of the least bad system that we could think of. But now that we have all these new technologies open to us, why not try and rethink how peer review works entirely? Why not make it better? Why not make it more kind of open and transparent? And there are various ways that this could be done. Tennant and colleagues proposed many ways that you could do this. Not all of them were kind of mutually compatible. Some of them were mutually exclusive, but many, many suggestions that were made across the last few years. And one of those suggestions was taken up by that bottom link there, Science Octopus. And this is a website that was created only this year on the basis of some of Tennant's proposals, where you have effectively like a TripAdvisor style community where each part of a research project can itself be reviewed. So someone can review the hypotheses or the methods, the analyses. They can even review someone else's review. So, if you put up on this website, okay, here's my problem, and someone can say, well, how well defined was it? How original is it? How important is that problem to address? And how scientifically valid was your hypothesis? How how well annotated were your results, and did you actually follow the methods that you said you were going to follow? How's the interpretation of those results? People can review each individual part of the research process, including other people's reviews. So okay, this person's a good reviewer, let's listen to them. This person's not a good reviewer. So if they give 1 star on everything and they're not a very good reviewer, then maybe we shouldn't necessarily weight that so highly. But all of this is to say there are various ways that you can enact open science, but why should we do it? We do it because we want research to be better. As many funders even now have kind of realized that open practices make better science, and so they now have it as prerequisites for getting and maintaining funding. So Plan S and Coalition S is part of that, and that's led to the open access publishing stuff that's going to be spoken about later. But you're also more likely to get null findings published, which means there's less wastage in science. The money doesn't go to waste. Science is still published. And you can consider it a value proposition where openness is in and of itself a freedom, and it gives an equal access and increased participation to those from kind of less economically well-off countries, as well as citizens who aren't themselves part of academic institutions. So if someone who's in an engineering firm, in a startup, they want to get access to some of these engineering articles, if things are open access, they don't have to kind of subscribe like a library would to all of these different journals. They can just get access to it openly, and that can help innovation as well. So there's many good reasons as a value proposition why this might be the case. And to go back to why registered reports might be better, you can see that the null findings seem to get published at a 5 times higher rate when you do registered report instead of non-registered report, and that's in biology and in psychology. And I'm sure this would extend to other disciplines as well, including the non-science disciplines. So what should you do? Obviously, this sounds like a heck of a lot. There's loads of stuff, especially for PhD students or even undergrad or master's students. So should we upend our entire research process immediately? I would say absolutely not. Give me 1 second, I'm just going to have a drink of water. Treat it more like a kind of a couch of 5K, where each small step to getting to your end goal is an improvement, and you're not expected to do from 0 to 100 immediately. And so if you can impressively increase your transparency, that's a great thing. No one's going to say, how dare you only do this, and not all of the rest of this. Instead, should be encouraged to say, wow, you've taken this extra step you didn't have to do. That's great. So now let's talking about part 3, how to do open research practices. There are various guides on how to do each individual part, the things that I've spoken about. So in terms of pre-registration, there's a number of guides that have been published over the last 4 or 5 years about how you might pre-register your work. The best time tends to be before you've collected any data, but it's not necessary that that's the case. You can pre-register after you've collected data, but before you've looked at it. And that isn't obviously ideal, but it definitely can be done. It's better than not doing it at all, because at least it lets you say, here are our hypotheses before we've looked at any of the data. So it kind of stops harking at the very least. And I'm willing to send these slides around so that people can click on the links, any of these kind of in slightly reddish font, they're all linked and they go directly to the articles being referenced. How do you do a registered report? So like I said, it's the logical extension of pre-registration. And there's a checklist that people have compiled of things to remember when you're doing a registered report. And there's a kind of a list of those or where you can kind of find journals that offer registered reporting kind of a type of publication. And there's around 300 and growing journals that currently offer this. And I imagine this will grow with time. But how about, doing open practice? How do you get it into your, for example, into your studies? So the best thing that you can do is discuss with your ethics department in your university or your local department, discuss with the ethics team, how can you get open access to your data or to your analysis scripts or anything like that into your consent forms, into your information sheets, and they'll come up with the correct wording so that it aligns with GDPR and other data protection laws to make sure that everything is both ethical and also transparent. And this, if you do this, then you are able to kind of just upload your data online and suddenly other people can have a look at your data. Obviously, for me, this is anonymized data. None of this is attributable to anyone. It's all anonymized, which makes it allowed to be published openly. So how do you make your analysis materials or your study materials open? You can use repositories like the OSF, which is a great free storage software, website that allows you to put many things, and you can keep stuff private until you want to make it public, which is a really useful tool because you can add stuff and remove stuff. And then once you're happy with it, once it's in a state where you're like, okay, this can now go public, then you can make it public. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. All right, as soon as I upload it, everyone can see it. And so this is one of my studies, and this is what it looks like from one of my PhD studies. And here you can see I made sure it's stored in Germany because the GDPR guidelines say that it has to be stored in Europe. They offer other storage locations like in America and such, but we would choose Europe because we're in the GDPRs. And then you can make subfolders for different parts of your analyses or your study that you want to make open, and then just upload like you would into Dropbox or OneDrive or Google Drive or whatever. It's very, very easy to use. And there you can see that's one of my analysis scripts that I just uploaded with ease. Anyway, now that I was speaking about analysis script, I'm going to hand over to James quickly so he can talk about reproducible data.
Thanks. As Sarah was saying at the start, we've all got our own hobby horses, and with Sarah's focus on pre-registration and attributing credit, my big one is computational reproducibility, reproducible analyses. And I guess the one thing to touch on what Sarah's just been talking about as well, but it's a cool study. It's like, if you ever have any concerns about some of these open practices getting permission to share data, someone actually did a study where they looked at, would your participants be put off by putting into the consent form that you're going to share the data? And essentially all they found from the study is people don't read the consent form. So they just, I think it was something like an average of 8 seconds that they read the information sheet and consent form, and they had to actually conduct a follow-up study to probe people and go, actually, what do you think about sharing data? And it was just more general concerns of, as long as we can't be identified, as long as it's safe, then people generally don't have any problems with it. Sorry, can you load these up, Sarah? So what I'm going to focus on is more of how can you demonstrate to people how you came to your conclusions? So one of the talks, there is a sort of series of talks called the Riot Science Talks. So these are similar to something I delivered there, where I talked about essentially my experience adopting these kind of open practices. One of my best contributions is just explaining how I've tried it and messed it up the first time. So as Sarah's talking about, it's more of a couch to 5K than starting as a marathon. You can add a couple of things in, see how they go, but really reflecting on how you improve as a researcher. So I guess the opposite of reproducible analyses, one of the first studies in my PhD, it was like classic response time data. So I got a couple of spreadsheets and I had to manually process the data so I could put it in SPSS and crunch some numbers. But then when I started using this thing called R, which is where you can do statistical programming, I redid those analyses and found out a couple of months later, I'd completely messed it up, where for some participants, I'd essentially mixed 2 columns up. So because I'd manually processed it, it was just a simple mistake, nothing nefarious. It was just sloppiness rather than intentionally trying to mess up, to mislead people. And then on this figure on the right, essentially I guess the scary part was that messing up meant that my key hypotheses were supported. It was supposed to be the first study of my PhD, got the shiny stars on top of the graph to show these were the significant differences I was interested in. But then when I redid those analyses and made it reproducible, it turns out they all disappeared. So that turned into these nice stars on top of the graph to pretty much just being 3 straight lines. So it shows its importance to, even when the results support what you're looking for, but you still really need to double check. Normally it's the opposite. We go, that looks a little bit off. I'll start having to poke around to see what went wrong. It was that initial, it supports my predictions, get that warm fuzzy feeling. But it turns out it was wrong as well. Next slide, please. So one of the ways we can avoid this is to make those analyses reproducible. So being able to demonstrate to people, I can't remember if it's the Royal Society or something similar, where it's like the phrase like, verify rather than trust, where we have that approach in science where it's kind of been taken as lip service, where a lot of articles can go, trust us, we did this right, we were very careful, don't worry about it. So it was this lack of open data. No one would ever share how they came to these conclusions. So it's about demonstrating if people do want to poke around. And there's been some recent cases, like if anyone's heard of the Daniel Ariely stuff, where he was like this honesty researcher, really highly cited. 10 years later, just happened to share the data and people noticed some weird irregularities. So if you can share the data and you can demonstrate to people that these you came to the right conclusions, your tests are robust to the tests that you've purported to do, it's going to increase trust through being able to verify those things. So being able to share your data, being able to produce analyze your data in a reproducible way so you can demonstrate it, not like how I messed up doing it in Excel, where it was lots of copying and pasting, pivot tables. and by the end, you don't know how you got there. Whereas if you do it in a reproducible way, you can always get to that point. You can still make mistakes, but at least those mistakes are documented and you can fix them. And ideally, if you can take the data all the way from the raw data you get from participants to the stuff that you use to plot your graphs, it's much more effective, and you can demonstrate and verify your findings. Next. But one of these things that can put people off is this initial experience. So I mentioned to use something called R, which is based on statistical programming, which for a lot of people that can be quite off-putting, but you don't need to let sort of software snobbery get in the way. There are different ways you can make your analyses reproducible without going to these eventual steps. So first one, a lot of people use SPSS. It's pretty horrible, but you can save the syntax that you use to produce your analyses. So if you want, you could share that and you can demonstrate it. The next easiest thing, Sarah mentioned something called a JASP or Jamovi. So they look very similar to SPSS, but have a couple of benefits. One, you can save the analyses in the same file, so they're retained. It's not like SPSS where you have one data file, one output file. It's all just rolled up in the same thing, and they're both open source. So rather than SPSS, you have to pay for an expensive license. They're a little bit more easy to access for people across the world. You don't need to have an institution license. Next step up is the things I was talking about, where I love using R. You can use something called Python as well. So that's also a scripted programming language that you can use for statistics. And if you want to go to the kind of highest level and ensure that in theory nothing can go wrong, so with R and Python code, it can go out of date. Whereas this thing called creating code capsules, where based on the settings and the versions you used at the time, you can essentially store information so it's always reproducible. And last one, I think, from me. And then there are different ways around this as well. So I talked about how some of my results went wrong just through copy and paste errors. That can also affect the results as well. So a lot of the time you would have, say, SPSS open on one page, your Word file as you're typing your results away on another. It's very easy to make a mistake, where the people who made this thing called stat check looked through a whole bunch of psychology articles and looked at about 50% had an error in the p-values, where they were either from rounding or just getting it completely wrong. And then I think about 12%, although I'm less certain of the figure off the top of my head, had a gross error. So that was a result that was significant, should really have been non-significant. Not to speculate on the kind of intention behind that, it was just an error. And that has important consequences, where if you're making conclusions based on that, it's going to affect where those conclusions go. So one of the things you can do is check it with this thing called stat check. So you can, if you save it as a PDF, you can run it through there. And it will tell you if there's any inconsistencies in your p-values. And then secondly, if you already use R, but you don't want to create your paper from within it, so there's these funky functions where you can do that. There's this thing called tidy stats, where you can get a Word plugin that takes analyses that you've done in R, and it will essentially create like that little statement where you report your statistical tests. So it's, again, to reduce copy and paste errors. Your analyses are much more reproducible. So that's everything from me, from my part.
All right, I know that we're running a bit late on time, so I'm going to try and rush through this next bit. But kind of, you can appropriately credit colleagues as well, as one of the other things I mentioned, as one of the kind of transparency things. And so credit is a system where you assign contributor roles on the kind of article title page. And that way you can say, okay, well, the supervisor on this project, you know, helped with the conceptualization, they helped with the funding acquisition, they helped with the methodology, and they also did, you know, supervision, and they wrote kind of in terms of reviewing and editing. So they did 5 roles. But someone who's a student might have conceptualized it, data curated, did the analysis, they did the investigation, they helped with the methodology, you know, they did the validation, they did the visualization, and they wrote up the original draft and the review. That's 9 roles. And it kind of, it's a way of them kind of making sure they get the credit that they deserve on the work that they're doing. And it means that you can reduce author disputes, you know, having author orders determined by how much of a contribution you made, and that can be seen by your roles. It also helps people identify good peer reviewers, because if someone is consistently on the visualization side of things, maybe they aren't actually appropriate to peer review something that's on a highly technical nature when it comes to biology or physics, if they're only good at visualization. However, it makes really good identification for the potential collaborators and opportunities for research networking, because if someone is really good at visualization of their data, you can email them and say, oh, I really liked your visualization on this paper. Can I, get some pointers, or how did you do this? What software did you use? That kind of thing. It's a way of identifying people in particular on their skills. And it also stops potential issues with supervisors taking credit for their students' work, which I don't believe is a problem within Coventry University, but it has been a problem in some research areas around the world. Also, you can post preprints and postprints. So if you're about to submit an article to a journal, many journals now are happy to allow for something called preprinting, where you put an unreviewed version, as long as it's openly stated that it's an unreviewed version of the paper, onto some kind of online repository. So Pure might be one example of how you can do that. ResearchGate, academia, SciArXiv is really useful for psychology papers, but there are other versions. Science Octopus, I mentioned earlier, you could put them up there. I mentioned that open access publishing is another part of of open science. That's going to be talked about by future people later on in today's Research Cafe, so I'm not going to get into that too far. And then there's also institutional changes. So you have kind of researchers that can push for institutional change within their university. So Thomas Jenkins, who's hosting today's Research Cafe, is one of the titles that he has is open science officer, I believe. And that didn't exist 2 years ago. So that there's been a push and a change in institution to allow for more openness and transparency in research across Coventry as a whole, which is fantastic. And pushing for more things like that, where you can get more kind of hierarchical support from it, and having the people like Thomas as open science officers to help provide the expertise that, and information to researchers is a really important move. And then you've also got the irresponsible use of metrics. And I don't have enough time to go into this, so I'm going to just very quickly skip over this, but just be aware that historically there have been some issues where things that you use to measure the quality of something, instead of becoming a measure, have become a target. And that, is a historic issue, and is something that hopefully can be changed with signing up to things like the San Francisco DORA and using next generation metrics, which are being pushed for and developed as we speak. Anyway, thank you for your time, and we are open to questions. And if in the future you have any other questions, you can email either James or me about any of these topics.
That was great. Thank you very much, Sarah and James. Yeah, lot of detail and lots of interesting things to follow up on there. Yeah, if you're happy for the slides to be shared and you want to send them on to me, I'll distribute them to the people present. That's no problem. Quick apology, I was slightly late off the mark in pressing the record button, Sarah, so I think I might have missed the first 2 minutes or so of your chat, but thank you to Toby for reminding me to do that. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, or if you're happy to unmute yourself and you have access to a microphone, please feel free to do that and ask questions that way. Yeah, my job title at the moment is Open Access Officer, but potentially we are looking to broaden that out in the coming year, so that might change. But thank you for the plug there. Appreciate it.
But it's the kind of thing that I think it's really important, as part of the open science and open research paradigm shift. Having institutional backing is a really, really important change, because 2 years ago, I don't think anyone in Coventry University was even, uttering the term open access. I remember having conversations with the library a few years ago. I was brought in because James and I had given these talks in 2019, and now they have an actual position for you. So that's a fantastic change in 2 years.
Yeah, I think one of the game changers in general has been the REF open access policy that came in a few years ago. I think that's forced a lot of universities to focus more resource on open access publishing and so forth.
Yeah. So Toby has kind of highlighted in the chat the Foundations for Open Scholarship Strategy Development and provided a link. I'm assuming you can put that, if wherever you're going to be publishing this recording, you can put that link.
Yes, definitely. Yes, thank you for that, Toby. That's helpful.
Yeah. One thing I will say is a lot of the stuff I touched on and James touched on was about quantitative research. I want people to be aware that if they're in the humanities and the arts, there is a huge discussion that started about 2019 and kind of really continued in force in 2020, was discussion about open qualitative research. And while that's not my expertise, I have been doing a lot of reading on it, and it sounds like a really interesting topic, and it's a completely different style of research. And so the conversations they're having are slightly different, but be aware that that conversation is happening and people are trying to make qualitative research more transparent and open as well.
Yeah, that's great. While we're waiting for any questions from the audience, I mean, I'll put a couple of questions to you if I may. So obviously the first one is basically like now Sarah and James, that you've both graduated, finished your PhDs and moved on from Coventry. Has anybody else within the sort of PGR community at Coventry taken on the open science baton from you? Is it still going, that kudos community?
So unfortunately, there aren't that many, because a lot of it was started by PhD students who were around in 2018, 19 and into 20. So there were kind of a few of them have moved off to America and stuff, so there's time difference issues. But we are very happy for anyone to take the baton from us. We still, occasionally check the Facebook group that we made, and I posted on there only a few weeks ago, we're looking to hand the baton over now that I think the last of us moved on. So if anyone does want to kind of at Coventry University take on that mantle, or even make so James mentioned riots talks. This is reproducible kind of talks, reproducible integrity and open something or other. It's science talks, and it was started at King's College London, and it kind of has developed into multi-university sites. So there's one in UCL, there's one in various other universities around the UK, and I think there's some opening in Europe as well. But if Coventry wants to develop their own riots group, then they can and integrate into that network.
Yeah, I guess last thing, and then we'll let people start the next talk. There's also another one called reproducibility, which is like, the idea is like a journal club. Obviously a little bit more useful now. People can start going back in and spend time with each other. Yeah, so the idea is that it's more of a journal club around open reproducible research. So we share it, occasionally we'll do talks, and those would like essentially franchise it out. I think there's over 150 now across different universities globally, and that was started out of Oxford, so that's another avenue.
I see Patrick's got his hand up. Patrick, do you want to ask a question?
Hi. Thanks, Sarah and James. I found that really fascinating, although I have to admit, as a humanities scholar, there were bits where I was struggling to keep up as well. But my question really sort of relates to that a little. Particularly, I think within humanities sort of open access channels, there's been, especially recently, a lot of discussion and debate, and a sense, I think, that open access discourse around open access, the language of open access, has either been hijacked by sort of big for-profit publishers, or was just never really, in its origins, wasn't really about fundamentally challenging a sort of liberal capitalist ethics of production. I wondered if that same debate, those same qualms are present in sort of open science at the moment, and what the differences might be in quite how that plays out, because I really don't know much about that.
If I may, James. So actually the open science kind of paradigm actually kind of developed from the Mertonian norms, which was spoken about in the 1940s, where communistic ideals were kind of far more to the fore, especially, until it got quashed in the Cold War era. But, kind of communal access to the scientific goods and, communal ownership of the scientific goods as well was one of the things that was being pushed for. So the open science movement sort of came out of this almost socialist, communist idea. So it's not necessarily capitalist in nature. It just, unfortunately, in kind of the modern neoliberal framework that we live in, you know, capitalist realism sets in, and everything is, you know, everything is taken in that sense. And now big journals like Elsevier and Sage, you know, that they are going to say, well, we need to make a profit somehow. So, you know, article processing charges, that's what we'll do. And so even if you're publishing open access, they can't charge per person reading them, so they'll charge the scientist to publish their own work. And that seems bonkers.
Yeah. I could spend like an hour talking about how much that stuff annoys me. So not going to get started, or I'll just keep going. But yeah, I guess for one thing to cap it off is that's kind of where the pre and post print movements came from, where, like Sarah's mentioned, you've got the ones who, I can never remember the difference, like the gold open access, where you can pay usually thousands and it'll be open access, and that's very nice, but it's very limited to the labs researchers who can afford that, with like the big dog grants coming in. Like normal researchers, it's just, you can't budget it, so you're kind of stuck in that system of, well, it's got to be hid behind a paywall because I can't pay the processing charge. But most, I think Sarah added in a link where it's like the Sherpa Romeo database, where individual journals will have their own policies, so it's worth double checking. But as like a quick look, if you put the name of a journal in there, it will tell you whether you can put a pre or post print. So usually, like my version is like, every article I've ever wrote, it's like I'm like a research pauper, so I've never had grant funding to be able to do it, but everything I've been able to add is like a post print afterwards. So it doesn't have a nice fancy formatting, but you can at least share the article, so like the author manuscript, and the vast majority of journals will let you do that. So it's a way of doing it without kind of falling into their policies and that kind of thing.
Yeah, Sherpa Romeo is one of the kind of main sources of reference that our team make use of in the library. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Right. Thank you very much, Sarah and James. Yeah, that was really, really interesting. And I'll take up with the Doctoral College about the idea of, you know, seeing if there's any PGRs who are interested in taking up the baton with open science, because it'd be really good to kind of keep that community going if possible. Brilliant. Okay, right. I'll hand over to our second presenter now, Toby Steiner from the COPIM project. So, Toby, if you want to share your screen.
Yep, I'm just working through the motions. Just a second.
I noticed we have just had a question come through from Jody. I think I might just leave that one till the end of the session, or Jody. But thank you for your question. Yeah,
I'm just going to type in the chat. So if you just I'll respond to it, and then let Toby go on with hers.
Yeah, I was thinking the same.
I mean, if you want to take the question, no matter, no problem.
No, it's okay. We're just delaying things. So I can add it. If there's nothing I can't put in the chat, so it's fine. You crack on with yours.
Okay, that's all right. That's fine. Okay, thanks everyone. I'll mute myself now. Over to you, Toby. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Let me see. Is this coming up on your end?
Yeah, I've got full screen with your open slide. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak here at the Open Research Café. In the next couple of minutes, I'll first be talking about open access in the humanities and social sciences, which we've previously already touched upon a bit, and then turn towards what we at the COPIM project currently are working on. So let me just maybe start with the simple question of the big why open access? I want to continue with what often is called this established or traditional way of publishing. Well, the thing is, the established way of publishing often leads to your research not being accessible to a wide audience, basically because of the simple fact that they won't be able to read it. On top of that, focusing on publishing models that rely on individual authors to pay for the publications adds to the issue of inequity, because it turns the question of who gets to publish their research into a question of who can afford to have their research published. So open access then helps to make sure that your research will receive the widest possible dissemination and has a lot of other benefits that for the purpose of this presentation, I won't go into too much detail about, but in a nutshell, it really is the most sensible thing to do if you want to make to spread your research, to have impact in the world with your research and whatnot. So which makes one wonder about the inverted question then, why are we not doing open research? As researchers and librarians and funders will tell you, it's a complicated matter, of course, but yeah, if we focus on that simple question, I think it can help us to recenter our motivations around how to engage in open research more prominently. Looking at the humanities and social sciences, we have a landscape that is, generally speaking, more focused on long-form research outputs. Most prominently books, of course, so monographs, edited collections, and all varieties. We have a bibliodiversity in presence in the humanities and social sciences, which is represented in the variety of different research fields, linguistic varieties, as well as a variety of approaches towards publishing. On the downside, there's less funding available to cover traditional open access books, while on the other hand, we have a prevalence of book processing charges based, aka paid by the author, publishing models. And on top of that, we also have an oligopoly of big publishers pursuing this BPC-based model, while on the other hand, the variety of small-scale approaches to a pluralistic field of small publishers and initiatives, such as the Radical Open Access Collective, which is also at home at Coventry University, or the Scholar-led consortium of small not-for-profit publishers. So this is just to maybe set the scene in a way of or the context within which COPIM is working in. So when we're taking a closer look at the area of book publishing, we have a variety of scholar-led publishing houses that have been pushing the development of innovative publishing and financing models for quite some time now. Larger university presses and commercial publishers are also beginning to take open access book publishing seriously. What now is becoming increasingly apparent is a greater trend towards big deals and transformative agreements, which is further marginalizing the existing diversity of academically run non-profit publishing initiatives, which in turn threatens to have a negative impact on the publication culture of the humanities and social sciences in particular, where, as stated before, long-form publications enjoy a high degree of relevance compared to journals. Smaller scholarly publishers, which are primarily active in the fields of humanities and social sciences, have been using alternative models to work with researchers and libraries for some time, which place greater emphasis on the partnership between libraries and publishers. Publishers such as Punctum Books, Lever Press, Language Science Press, and Open Book publishers enable libraries to contribute funds via membership models and thus sustainably support the respective in-house productions outside of BPCs. However, it is precisely this commitment that is further marginalized by transformative agreements and big deals, as transformative agreements often block large sums of money, and as a result, there is less budget available for the diversity of small publishers. From the point of view of the individual publisher, there is also the fact that with the large number of activities that publishers have to plan for beyond their actual publishing activities, in order to compete with the bigger players, an upper limit is quickly reached with regard to available resources due to the small size of the publishing house. Libraries in turn complain about the insufficient relevance of individual initiatives vis-a-vis decision makers such as funding institutions and library networks, but also libraries themselves, as the cost-benefit effort to integrate an individual initiative into the library's funding grid quickly exceeds the actual funding amount. With COPIM, the community-led open publication infrastructures for monographs project, we are therefore focusing on a networked approach under the guiding principle of scaling small, an approach that focuses on cooperation between publishers, infrastructure providers, and libraries. Scaling small stands in contrast to the classic economics of scale, which usually only strive in the direction of consolidation, equalization of diversity, and centralized growth. With scaling small, we are working to establish a horizontal partnership-based and non-competitive network between independent community-led initiatives. The aim is to establish an alternative that moves away from competition and the hunt for the most lucrative individual contracts towards a horizontal partnership approach of cooperative exchange between small and medium-sized open access publishers, infrastructure providers, and libraries. With scaling small, the cooperative and value-led collaboration in the partner network leads to processes and results being shared openly with interested new initiatives. We see advantages in maintaining independence coupled with shared access to good practice and common experience. In addition, the jointly used infrastructures are operated and developed jointly and in partnership, which will benefit everyone. In our view, such a community-led alternative is urgently needed to implement a path away from the limited and highly exclusionary focus on single publications embodied by book processing charges and big deals, and thus to anchor bibliodiversity and publishing in all facets of diversity more centrally in the scholarly publishing landscape. With COPIM, we have been working on realizing this alternative for almost 2 years now. We rely on an international partner network of publishers, infrastructure providers, libraries, and consortia organizations working together as equals. At the start of the project, the partner network identified 6 different perspectives on open access book publishing and specified barriers to open access, which are now being addressed by different teams. These include questions of the transition to open access, the governance and experimental publishing, as well as technical aspects such as the development of an approach to open dissemination, archiving, and the development of a consortium platform, the Open Book Collective. So let's take a quick look maybe at what the different work packages deal with. With work package 7, work package 7 is working to identify the main challenges related to archiving open access monographs in all their diversity and complexity. The colleagues in work package 7 are investigating how archiving and preservation can be facilitated, especially for small publishers, in order to integrate archiving work more centrally into the publication process. For this reason, work package 7 is also closely linked to the metadata work in work package 5 in order to be able to include archiving specific metadata in the to be developed open dissemination system. This brings me to work package 5, which aims to develop processes and tools to facilitate the open dissemination of open access books. This is achieved by providing a dissemination system based entirely on open principles in the sense of open data and open source, which is currently being developed under the name of TOTH. On the one hand, TOTH as a tool already directly facilitates the creation and dissemination of a larger number of book-related metadata standards for publishers. And in addition to that, the team in work package 5 is also working on a concept for the provision of TOTH as a metadata service that supports publishers and libraries in the adaptation of these open standards. The first metadata formats already are available, and those under development and are under output channels are shown schematically in the slide. So this is JSON, BibTeX, KBART, and all that. In the larger context, TOTH also aims to open up the metadata ecosystem, which has so far been strongly fragmented and characterized by proprietary providers. Implementations of the metadata service will be found in the near future on the websites of Punctum and Open Book Publishers, for example. In addition, the open metadata model will also become part of the Open Book Collective platform. More on this in a moment. But back to the work package 6, which I've conveniently left out between 7 and 5, of course. In collaboration with Open Humanities Press, Mattering Press, and Open Book Publishers, all of whom are members of the Scholar Collective, the team in Work Package 6 is developing a series of pilot projects on experimental publishing. For these pilot projects, we have been able to recruit colleagues from TIB Hannover in Germany, the Universidad Iberoamericana Ciudad de Mexico in Mexico, and Goldsmiths University of London, who are each exploring with their own teams how book publications can be realized in an experimental way when, for example, collaborative practices or the integration of digital content such as 3D models are brought together in the process of creating a book. In addition, collaborative exchange with work packages 7 and 5, so archiving and the metadata work package, is also sought here in order to directly consider questions of metadata creation and archiving. Now, the work package, the team in work package 4 deals with research-led questions of community governance. The colleagues support the overall project collective as well as individual work packages in the development of governance processes. In particular, there is a lively exchange with work package 2 to develop a community-led governance model and structure for the coordination, management, and administrative support of the Open Book Collective platform. And this is where my colleague Patrick Hart is also working in, but you'll hear from him later on. Waving. Next one is work package 3, which is working with 2 internationally active university publishers to support them in the transition of their business models to non-book processing charges open access, and to document this process. The Opening the Future model, developed by Professor Martin Eve and now being piloted by Central European University Press and Liverpool University Press, gives member libraries subscription access to the publisher's backlist, with the revenue generated being used to fund new frontlist publications in open access format. And last but by no means least, the colleagues of Work Package 2 are busy working out the concept of the Open Book Collective. With the Open Book Collective, we want to create a platform that will foster the exchange of information, the generation, as well as management of income from open access books. Under the guiding principle of scaling small, this will be a federated virtual space which will include an information service for all questions about open access books. In addition, scholar-led initiatives will present their publishing activities here, while interested libraries will have the opportunity to support individual initiatives as well as consortia, such as scholar-led via the platform. I think it is important to note here that we are focusing on supporting the whole publishing cycle and are not merely selling individual books or book series. So this is more a focus on supporting the presses themselves and not only the outputs that they are creating. In addition, it is important to us, for us to emphasize that we make infrastructure providers such as the Directory of Open Access Books, OAPM, and the metadata service TOTH visible as distinct parts of this platform, as we see this group of stakeholders as is dispensable for a sustainable open access ecosystem for books. Likewise, results from the archiving and preservation work package will be included to cover the entire life cycle of open access books. And the integration of the Opening the Future model into the platform is also being planned. We currently expect to launch a first beta version of the platform during this winter semester, so hopefully in early 2022. All of this aims to create a consortial scholar-led model that enables interested stakeholders to publish together, realize collaborative funding, and inform jointly about open access books, while respecting community-led governance and a value system shared by all. As outlined, we are currently working with our project network in COPIM on some of the most important technological, structural, and organizational hurdles that stand in the way of a broader acceptance and impact of open access books. The work in the project network has also contributed to increasing the publication activities of the members working in the consortium. Here's an overview of reports produced in COPIM. We are convinced that the work of COPIM contributes to an important step towards open community-led infrastructures and processes, and towards a fair and sustainable open access ecosystem for book publishing. The already published results and developments of the projects are certainly of interest to both existing open access book publishers and publishers wishing to switch to open access. COPIM publishes all results fundamentally under open licenses, and we would like to encourage interested publishers and other stakeholders to make use of them. With the principle of scaling small at the heart of COPIM's way of working, finding connections between projects with similar goals is an important part of collaborative working. This refers to the formation of our COPIM partner consortium itself, and also extends to a variety of other independent projects, initiatives, and infrastructures, as listed here. But drawing from that, we are always interested in making new connections, of course. So in case you want to know more about the different work packages or are interested in getting more directly involved, don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Toby. That was a really kind of interesting overview of everything COPIM is doing, which is a lot. There's a lot of work packages, aren't there? A lot of things going on. Brilliant. Right. If anyone has any questions for Toby about COPIM, open access books, things like that, please either put them in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and ask them. I'll just give it a couple of moments to see if anyone has got any questions, and if not, I'll butt in with one or two of my own. There we go. Right. I'll open up myself then, if that's okay, Toby. First thing, just to say, I really like the logo for Toth. Is it supposed to be like a kind of a pharaoh type?
Yeah, actually, Toth is an Egyptian god of wisdom and knowledge. Apparently, he has many names, but yeah.
Also, it's one of those words like, how do I pronounce this? So I'm really glad that you showed us the correct pronunciation.
And it's really interesting because in Egyptian, apparently, there is no TH, or in Old Egyptian, there was no TH. So basically the name or the spelling of the name leaves an O. But yeah, apparently, I don't know, Old Egyptians have figured out that this would be the spelling of the name, and yeah.
Am I right? So in terms of the COPIM project, it's funded for 3 years. That's correct, isn't it? And we just about come to the end of the second year of the end of the second year. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We've just published our most recent annual report.
So in thinking about, obviously, once the COPIM project formally ends, could you just talk a little bit about what the kind of what the legacy and kind of afterlife of the COPIM project is intended to be?
Well, to be honest, we are currently in active conversation between ourselves to figure that out, because in a way, the project itself has come together as a variety of different but also distinct approaches to open access and different needs from different players in or stakeholders in the network. And So what we're trying to figure out at the moment is if, for example, there will be a COPIM 2.0, for example, to carry on the work that we did as a project in its entirety, or if there might be spin-outs, spin-offs, whatever you might call them, for example, for the metadata service or the open book collective platform, because those are the more tangible, concrete outcomes that we will be producing and which we will want to develop further, I think. So, for example, the Open Book Collective is actively looking to implement a business plan that is planning for the next 5 years, and to use the COPIM project as an initial startup, but then develop things outwards on its own going forward. But yeah, but in the end, I think we don't have or just as of now, we don't have an elaborate plan of how the project will continue because of the variety of different stakeholders and different goals behind the different work packages as well, and also other other external stakeholders such as JISC, for example, or other platforms that might be interested in taking up the work that we've been doing. So we are in conversation, for example, with people at the European Open Science Cloud. We are, as JISC is part in our consortium, we are in active talks with JISC about that. But at the moment, it's all still very much in development, and we hope that the journey continues afterwards, but who knows?
Yeah, COPIM 2.0 sounds good if you can get the funding and support for that. A question from Sarah in the chat. With the normalization / standardization of metadata that the project wishes to produce, are you worried that people may diverge again after the COPIM project finishes without greater institutional push for standardizing metadata?
Thanks, Sarah. That's a great question, and the the comic that James posted there as well, of course, is always an issue about standards. And I think what we are aiming for is not necessarily implementing new standards, but opening up the existing landscape of or the landscape of existing standards towards an open ecosystem that everybody can contribute to. So in a way, we would actually invite further development in other places in the spirit of open source and open data, so that others take on the work that we have started. But on the other hand, we also have this the work on the metadata service itself, which of course will also need a bit of more centralized input and consolidation in a way. But as we see it, we want to have this guided by a values-based system based on scaling small, and to allow or to make space, to make room for divergence and further development in other venues as well. So I think that's not really a problem, because we don't want to become the big guiding or the big leading behemoth that governs everything in this metadata space. So it's more of actually enabling the network of publishers to be able to make their work seen in the larger metadata landscape, because as we have found over the last couple of years, this is still very much a closed space, and so our initiative or our motivation really is to open that up to more engagement from anybody, basically.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. If anyone's got, just give it a moment if anyone has any other questions for Toby. If not, we'll pass on to Patrick, our third presenter. I suppose just to make a quick point that open access kind of book publishing and publishers trying to come up with their own models to facilitate it, rather than relying on the book processing charge system, which you messaged in your presentation. It does seem to be gaining a lot of traction, even with publishers that aren't directly working with COPIM. I mean, in the last month or so, I've come across initiatives from Cambridge University Press who are coming up with their own way of trying to make books open access. I think it's called Flip It Open or something like that, the Cambridge model. I know University of Michigan Press as well are kind of looking at some kind of membership style model. So yeah, there is a lot going on in this space, isn't there? And you know, it's catching up now with open access journal publishing.
Yeah, indeed. Also, for example, MIT Press very much invested in that space and trying to implement a membership model of their own. So there's a lot of movement in that space at the moment, and exciting to see what comes out in the end in the next couple of years.
Yeah, but yeah, thank you very much, Toby. That was really interesting. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
Okay, so I will pass over to our third presenter now, Patrick Hart. He's going to be talking about the trials and tribulations of editing an open access journal. So Patrick, I'll mute myself now, and then if you want to.
Okay. I'll just try and share my screen here. Okay. Hope that's working. Is that okay?
Yeah, we can see your title slide, yeah.
Grand, thanks. Okay, so yeah, as I've said, I've titled this talk, Editing an Independent Open Access Journal. I've changed it slightly to Ramblings from the Front Line rather than Tales. The front line, yes, it has sometimes felt like a bit of a war zone. There are other analogies or metaphors that could be used, and maybe we'll come to some of those. So I should perhaps introduce myself. I'm one of the editors and one of the two founders of the Journal of the Northern Renaissance. I'll say more of that in a moment. As Toby mentioned, I'm also a member of the COPIM project, which I joined in September, when I also started work as a curator at the National Library of Scotland. So it's been a busy month or so. I'd like to really begin by sending apologies on behalf of my fellow editor, Lindsay McCulloch, who unfortunately had to pull out of this talk this morning due to COVID-related childcare issues. So I'll do my best to cover the ground that she would have done, but I'm sorry if this is a little bit rambling as a result of that. So my understanding is that many of you here, or at least some of you here, are probably doctoral students. I don't know how many of you are in the humanities, social sciences, the sciences, but perhaps that will come up in the chat afterwards. But I'll begin by saying something briefly about the journal itself. I'll then try and set the journal and what I want to go on to say about it within the context of some wider discussions happening around open access. And I'll make particular reference to one earlier talk in this Open Access Week in particular, and to that broader discourse. I'll then talk about the current moment that our journal finds itself in, and the decisions facing us. I might even ask you for some suggested solutions. So the Journal of the Northern Renaissance, here it is. It's an online open access journal that was founded by myself and Sebastian Verveege, who's now a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol in English Studies, back in 2008, when we were both doctoral students in Glasgow. And I think it only happened because both of us were so completely clueless about publishing academic publishing in general and open access publishing in particular. So I think it was Jody had a question or comment in the chat about not knowing where to begin. I'm a model, at least humanities, of where you can get by just sort of jumping in. The remit of the journal, I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So the remit of the journal, just to say a little bit about what it deals with, is, as the name suggests, the Northern Renaissance. The Renaissance is typically defined as a period from the later medieval to the early modern eras, during which time Europe rediscovered its antique past and the histories and cultures of classical Greece and Rome. This is a story I'm sure is familiar to all of you. But the reception of the classical past and the innovations that took place in Southern Europe, mainly Italy, have generally taken scholarly precedence over the cultural activities of Northern Europe. I'm sure most of you, if I say Renaissance, we think of Italy, maybe France. So the transmission of ideas to nations north of the Alps, Northern engagement with that classical inheritance has been traditionally underestimated or misunderstood. And the distinct traditions and aesthetics of Northern Europe in this period, in some cases, have been undervalued. And any notion that the North had a profound influence over the South in this period used to be dismissed out of hand. Now, art historians like Gombrich and Panofsky started to chip away at this with studies focusing on Netherlandish and German art. But it was only really towards the end of the 20th century that the concept of the Northern Renaissance started to gain some kind of currency. So our journal sprang up as a forum for thinking about this, for debates around this question. Like the Renaissance itself, it doesn't privilege any one cultural practice. We've published articles on medieval and early modern history, on art, literature, music, religion, science, and mathematics across a wide geographical spread. This raises some issues, which I'll come back to. We've become particularly well known for foregrounding Scotland's role in the Northern Renaissance and for the quality of the work we've published in that field. So where did the journal come from? Now, as a grad student, I'd worked on Ecloga, which is Strathclyde University's open access English studies working papers journal. Here's a copy. I'll say more about that in a moment. And Sebastian had worked on E Sharp, which is Glasgow University's postgraduate journal. So I think the existence of JNR is a testimony to the importance of postgraduate journals as a training ground, and often a first dip into issues around open access. So I was studying at what was then called the Scottish Institute for Northern Renaissance Studies, which was a sort of collaborative virtual institute run by the universities of Edinburgh, Glasgow, Stirling, and Strathclyde. And they too, as the name suggests, were focused on this central question. So partly thanks to being there, we, as an institute and as two grad students, saw a scholarly gap, set up the journal with support from the institute, mostly in the form of advice, but also a little financial support. We managed to wheedle, I think, a couple of £100 out of the institute, largely for web hosting, but which I realized also paid for real posters and postcards to advertise it, which now seems incredibly quaint. And those must have turned into real collector's items. And those were sort of sent round to every university in the UK. What happened then was that within a year or two of the journal launching in 2009, the institute itself folded, and it folded largely as a result of the higher administrations of particularly the prestige universities, let's say, of that group of four, withdrawing their support from it. Why collaborate with our competitors was apparently the question that the academics involved in the institute were asked. Now, most library catalogues still list the journal as the official journal of this institute, and that's pretty much the only trace you can find of it online now. And shortly afterwards, Ecloga, which was open access online and had a very limited print run, mainly, I think, for the vanity of us, the editorial team, and contributors, that too vanished. This is the what you get if you go to the webpage of the journal, and it hasn't moved anywhere else. It is, some parts of it, I think, are on the UK Web Archive, are preserved there, but some of it, at least several issues of it, are completely lost. I'm slightly relieved, as it had some of my now slightly embarrassing sort of early grad student efforts in it, but apart from that, it had some good papers, and it's a real shame. And I think this really set the context for how we were thinking about the journal. And as I said, we weren't, discourse around open access in the humanities was really only beginning to develop around 2009, 2010. So we were just really following our noses in terms of how things should be, that obviously they should be open for everybody to read freely, that anybody should be able to submit without paying a fee. But this was something of a traumatic experience for us, with the ending of this institute and the shutting down of Ecloga. So we were very determined that we wanted to be as independent as possible, and we moved on to WordPress, a platform both of us were reasonably familiar with, and again was a lot simpler back then. We looked at alternatives like the open journal system, but decided it was too clunky at the time and seemed designed for much bigger projects, even multi-journal projects, rather than something much smaller like our journal. The other factor we had to consider was that we were both early career researchers, and neither of us knew where we might be in a year or two at that point. So in many ways, I think I'm really telling you this to explain that this is perhaps exactly how open access journals shouldn't start in many ways. We didn't know much. We didn't have a great level of technical proficiency. We had some academic guidance from on high, but that was very much focused on the academic content of the journal rather than on sort of questions of open access or the more technical end of things. So we've been going for 13 years. We're still going, and we've made a real niche for ourselves. We have professors from major institutions approaching us to publish special issues around conferences they're running. As I'll indicate in a moment, we've contributed to the building of careers. And most importantly of all, I think we've published lots of exciting, rigorous, unusual scholarship that might otherwise have struggled to find a place. And we've brought different disciplines and different geographies into conversation. So this is really to say, if maybe as a grad student, you're thinking of editing a journal, or if you've somehow edited up editing a journal and are thinking, I wish we weren't starting from here, I sympathize. But I think there's something to be said for, again, it's impossible to know everything there is to know about open access publishing, and there's something to be said for just jumping straight in and being guided by your principles and values. Where is the Journal of the Northern Renaissance now? Well, I think we've reached something of a crisis point with our journal, but one that has lots of potential in it. We're asking ourselves questions over the journal's role, our role in it, and its future in particular in relation to the open access movement, whatever that is. So I'd like to begin talking about this at a point where really the broadest of overarching perspectives on open humanities, on open access, at least with relation to the humanities, meets up with a kind of quibble over the terminology we're using. So for me, Open Access Week this year began with a talk on Monday afternoon by my predecessor in my post at Coventry and at COPIM, Samuel Moore. His talk was entitled, "What's the Point of Radical Open Access?" And he expressed a fair degree of pessimism or skepticism regarding some of open access's more grandiose claims to be changing the world, to be transforming academia. And he noted in particular, and this is a screen grab from his talk, which he very kindly said I could use, pointed out there, and I couldn't agree more, building structural equity, which I think is the ultimate project, is not possible under the structures of capitalism, which continue to regulate academia. Now this excellent talk, I think it was recorded and I hope it's going to be released soon. I recommend it. This led into a discussion which spilled over onto Twitter, where another COPIM colleague followed this up. And here are his tweets. I won't go through them all, but I think that first one, he writes about the growing realization that most of the momentum towards open access has been captured by one faction, the profit-seeking commercials. Oops, sorry, getting over enthusiastic. This means that those who seek something beyond expanded access and reuse rights from open access have to cleave this from that, existing from hoped for open access. Now, I want to argue that we need to cling on to the sort of utopian dream, if you like, behind open access, while remaining very much grounded in the political realities. As you can see, he went on to note that we've always folded too much under the open access label, and concluded his thread with this phrase, which I really like: "Welcome to Open Ambivalence Week." Which is what I'm calling it too. I'm stealing this. And I think it's this ambivalence around what open access is, what it means, what it's become, is one that really chimed with both Lindsay and I as editors, and the conversations we've been having about the function of our journal. The discussion also touches on a very basic level on what we call ourselves. We're usually described, and we sometimes describe ourselves, or have done, as a diamond open access journal. Everything we publish is free to read. It's also free to submit and publish work with us. There are no article processing charges or APCs. We're a member of the Radical Open Access Collective, and this decision to be open access at both ends, as it were, to readers and authors, reflects those values. For us, if as a journal you're using APCs or otherwise charging would-be contributors, calling yourself an open access journal is really problematic. But organizations supposedly dedicated to open access often specifically define it to include so-called gold open access. There's lots of examples, more or less at random. This is from Open Access Australasia. There in the middle, you'll see gold open access article processing charges may be involved. This is under a slide heading saying full open access is. There's another one that says what it's not. So this is very explicitly saying that this is open access. Now, I think, well, firstly, I should mention before coming to work at Coventry, I was an academic in Turkey for almost a decade. You know, almost none of my Turkish friends and colleagues would have been able to get their institutions to pay article processing charges, and currency exchange rates, especially just now, mean they really struggle to pay them themselves. But I think for our journal, even adopting the term diamond seems to play into the hands of neoliberal academia and the big profit-seeking commercial academic publishers. And in attempting to trump them at their own game by saying diamond is more valuable than gold, we're still falling into the lexicon of the academic marketplace and thereby legitimizing its overall capture of open access. And I think this is where the wider thinking about shaping an alternative academic space within the predominating model really connects with our own ongoing experiences as editors. Now, we've played that game to an extent. We've pursued a certain status with what Danica Dema, our COPIM colleague and my boss, has called the current attention system and politics of valuation in academia. And we've been quite successful in this. So we very recently had, I received an email from Dr. Michael Ulyut at University of Calgary, who wrote to us, "I feel I owe the journal my successful tenure application," and saying he'd be glad to give back and offering to get involved in some way. Now, our own, we've sort of played that game, but recently we've been thinking about all the ways that we're not open. By mainstream measures, we are a diamond journal, but we're the open access world, I think, can be particularly susceptible to a specific kind of cultural barrier. And let me see if I can pull this up. This quote is from a book by Christina Dunbar Hester, which is discussing cultures of hacking and open technology. And she talks about how their specific cultural barriers to addressing issues of exclusion, including the belief that these communities, these hacker communities, are open to whoever wants to be there, have tended to perpetuate the notion that if some people are not there, it is because they do not wish to be. So we've been looking at our editorial team, and there are 7 of us now, one on long-term sick leave, but we're almost entirely white. We're majority are male, mostly from sort of lower middle class backgrounds, and there's something wrong there, clearly. And if we want to pursue the kind of open ethics, I think that Sarah was talking, that's something we have to address. So we're trying to really expand our understanding of open access. There's lots more I think I could pursue here, particularly in our relation to the university. And I'm going to skip over these questions of JNR's turning point and introduce Humanities Commons, which is the new platform, also run on WordPress, that we're looking to move on to. And I'm happy to talk about that if anybody would be interested. which we're hoping will resolve a lot of the issues that we as an independent journal have had. But I'd just like to conclude with this quotation, which is one that is dear to my heart, and I was thrilled to see Sam bringing it up in the talk I referred to on Monday, about the position of truly open humanities journals in relation to the university. This is from Harney and Moten's The Undercommons. For them, it cannot be denied that the university is a place of refuge, and it cannot be accepted that the university is a place of enlightenment. In the face of these conditions, one can only sneak into the university and steal what one can. To abuse its hospitality, to spite its mission, to join its refugee colony, its gypsy encampment, to be in but not of. This is the path of the subversive intellectual in the modern university. Now, I think increasingly we feel that this is where our journal is situated. In my more optimistic, friendly moments towards academia, I heckle a bit at some of this, but at other moments it feels absolutely spot on. So I think really for us, we're increasingly seeing a concern with open access as really just a kind of gateway drug into much deeper thinking about what it means to open up academia as a whole. There's lots more I'd like to say, but I realize I've gone on for a while, and I want to make sure we have time to answer questions and hopefully talk about this a bit more. So I'll wrap up there. But if anyone would like to get in touch after this event, happy to hear from you. And of course, if you want to have a look at the journal itself, you can find it open access online. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Patrick. That was really interesting. It's quite inspirational, actually, in a way, that you're able to start up a journal, not necessarily knowing anything, and that 12, 13 years on, it's still going, and you actually made it viable. That's quite inspirational in a way. So yeah, well done.
There's a lot to be said for just charging in head first. I think sometimes it comes with problems, but which again I'd be happy to talk about more. But yeah,
I'll just if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself. Sarah says open access as a gateway drug is a fun way of discussing things beyond as an avenue into the open research paradigm and beyond. Yes, interesting. I'd never heard of that term before as a gateway drug, but no, it's an interesting one.
I think in a way, I mean, I really like Sarah's couch to 5K analogy as well. I mean, for anybody out there sort of trying to feel their way into open access publishing, whether as an editor, an author, however, I still feel like I'm at the point where I can probably stagger around a 5K in half an hour in open access terms, but there's, again, I think it's something to, as soon as you actually start trying to do something, thinking, okay, where am I actually going to send this article, and who is going to read it, and who do I want to read it? That's when you start, that's the way to engage with these issues a lot, I think, rather than sort of in the abstract necessarily.
I've just got a message saying my internet connection is unstable, so apologies if I I think you highlighted one of the big challenges with sort of independent open access journals is around preservation, and that old Strathclyde Institute journal is now completely in more or less inaccessible. Do you have a preservation strategy for your journal? Yeah.
Yeah, we do. And I'm afraid I slightly mistimed my talk, or I might have gone into it in a little bit more detail. But this is one of the reasons we're looking at moving to Humanities Commons, which I know has just won close to $1 million award to develop further, and is looking to develop a social sciences and a STEM equivalent as well. And I think for people in those areas, that would be worth looking out for. H Commons, for anyone who doesn't know about it, and if you are in the humanities, I'd really recommend checking it out, really began as a kind of alternative to platforms like academia.edu, which are for-profit ventures that I would recommend steering clear of. And Toby knows much more about this, I think, than I do. But that's a platform that is now starting to host journals, that has what it's called the core depository, provides DOIs automatically. So we've really, for 5 or 6 years, this has been something I've been very concerned about with our journal, is what would happen if we went down. And we had to move to a new host fairly recently, and that was a fairly traumatic experience for various reasons. And we had to take the journal offline for 4 or 5 days, and already we had, rightly, we had concerned authors saying, "What's happening? Where's my article gone?" And as we've seen, people's tenure can rely on this. So that's really a priority for us. There are lots of other options that we're also looking at, some of which Toby talked about. But at the moment, I think we're leaning towards the H Commons solution. Thanks for the link, Toby. Toby's just put that in the chat.
Yes, no worries.
the H Commons link.
Yeah. If we can maybe just piggyback on the alternative to ResearchGate and Academia Edu, I think this also harks back to the question of that I think we as researchers actually need to reflect upon the choices we make upon where to disseminate our research to. So while I appreciate that Academia Edu or ResearchGate, of course, have a wide spread and a wide reach because of their social network approach in a way, I think we still have to be aware that it's as Patrick mentioned, a commercial venture, and they will most definitely make a case of charging you in one way or the other. And as people might know, there's maybe very there's a saying, if you don't know how, no, I'm getting it wrong, sorry. I'm lost in thought here, but basically saying that it makes sense to actually focus on non-commercial entities, because otherwise if you're not buying the product, you will be the product in terms of data reselling and everything. And I think especially Academia Edu has made it an important point to advertise as much as possible and to profit from the input that they are receiving through free labor from researchers. And and I'm just thinking, if people are interested in following up on more on these conversations around Academia Edu and ResearchGate, I'll just post a link to a tweet I posted earlier this week around valid critiques around Academia Edu and ResearchGate, because there's been a history of researchers pointing out the fallacies behind these platforms and to look for alternatives, for example, such as Humanities Commons or the archive solutions you have out there, or the Open Science Framework. So yeah, just to place that here as well.
Yeah, that's useful for me actually, because I do a session for new PhD students as part of becoming a professional researcher week, where we look at platforms for dissemination and kind of social, academic networking and things like that. So yes, I will read up on that. I have been promoting Humanities Commons and the Open Science platforms. So yes, I'm quite glad that they've been mentioned.
Support your local nonprofits.
If just one last question, Patrick, if I may. So obviously one of the big components of my job is dealing with kind of these overarching open access initiatives, things like Plan S, and the impact that they have on funders and funder policies, and advising authors on how they can comply and things like that. Something like Plan S, which for people who don't know, it's kind of it's an open access initiative which a number of major research funders have signed up to, and one of the goals is to try and get funders to flip business models from subscription access to open access. Is Plan S kind of helpful to diamond open access journals, or not? Are you going to lose your place in the market if suddenly all these subscription journals start changing their business models over? And is it hard for you to comply with Plan S conditions and so on?
I think again, I think this is probably a question that Toby is much better equipped to answer than I am. But I do know that when I looked at Plan S, and I'd have to go back to it again, I felt fairly disenchanted with it, particularly sort of looking at it as the editor of a small so-called diamond journal. My thing is really, I'm not sure if it's about where sort of academic change will come from, or if it's just simply what I'm interested in and want to commit to. But I feel it has to come from below, not from above. And yeah, if Elsevier or Sage or whoever start flipping their journals into to something that does look like diamond open access, I'm going to be very, very skeptical about what's going on. But Toby, I'm sure you've got a more nuanced take on this and better informed.
Well, to be honest, I don't think so. It's just, it's this big behemoth out there that people are talking about, and that is, I think, influencing policy on the international level as well. But as you say, Patrick, in a way, I think it doesn't have diamond open access journals at its focus, because it is much more interested in the transformative agreement approach and transforming non-open access and traditional publishers. And that's of course a valid perspective if you want to pursue this market-based approach towards sustaining the capitalist publishing landscape, and not to sever ties with the big publishing houses. But on the other hand, there's these small community-led approaches such as that one that Patrick has presented, and there's tons of others out there. There's just recently been a major report in earlier this year, I think it was, about the open access diamond journal landscape, and that showed that there's tens of thousands of journals out there internationally that keep working on less than 1 FTE per journal, and that's if you bring that towards the discussion with Elsevier, they will just laugh about it and forget about it, because it's not worth their time. So in a way, it's trying to frame policies for apples, but you have a basket of oranges on your table, and it's just not very compatible, I think. And I think we need to think beyond Plan S, while also acknowledging the existence, of course, and the importance of it, because the funders say so, I think. But it's a complex system, of course. But still keeping in mind that there's other alternatives out there and supporting them as well, I think is very important to do for libraries, for funders, for everyone, and for researchers, of course. Yeah.
Cool. I see Sarah's got her hand up. So Sarah, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, this was actually a separate question for Patrick, but during your talk, you mentioned that the term open access has kind of been usurped or hijacked by the kind of neoliberal capitalistic framework. And you've been relegated to a subpart of it, diamond open access. Do you think that trying to differentiate yourself, not using the term open access, but using another term would be beneficial or detrimental to you in the future? Or like, is almost, unfortunately, piggybacking off the now popular usage of the term open access is beneficial for diamond open access journals, or is it detrimental to them?
Can you hear me okay? Sorry, my headphone just made a dying sound. So I think in a way what that quote I gave from the Undercommons suggests to me is that to an extent we have to be hypocritical or two-faced about this. That when I'm facing sort of big academia, for want of a better term, we play the game. We try and get bits of funding where we can. We try and raise our profile. But outside of that, I mean, again, speaking very personally, as editor of the journal, I feel I'm not interested in playing that game anymore. And there are enough other people out there who don't want to play it. And the kind of adjunctification and worse of academia is maybe especially in the humanities that's going on. There are so many people who are in sort of para-academic posts or non-academic posts who are still engaged with research and producing research, who want to read research, that I'm inclined to just reject the terminology completely, at least when I'm facing in that direction. And those people know what's going on anyway, so it becomes less of an issue. But if I have to call the journal a diamond open access journal to put in a funding bid, I'm going to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I do find that terminology around open access is a rather tortured thing, isn't it? I'm going through our LibGuide open access pages at the moment, and I'm rewriting like the glossary section, and I'm disagreeing with the definitions I came up with 2 years ago and redrafting them. And yeah, it's quite awkward to define gold and diamond and bronze, and yes, there's a lot of terminology. Okay, I think yeah, we're at 2 o'clock now. Yeah, so big thank you to our 4 presenters today. If people are still on the call and they're able to do a virtual round of applause on their reactions, then please do so, because you deserve a round of applause. It's been really, really interesting. I will share the recording with the presenters. If everyone's happy with it, then we'll look at sharing it more widely. But yeah, it's been a really interesting session from my perspective today. So big thank you to everyone for coming along, and hope you found it beneficial and interesting.
Thank you, Thomas. Thanks for inviting us along.
No problem. Yeah, it's always a slightly awkward, like, how do you end an online? So yes, feel free to leave the chat, and thank you very much. And yeah, I'll email people with slides and things where those have been shared. So okay, thanks a lot, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks all.